Welcome to the Truman Charities podcast. I am Jamie Truman, your host. Today, I spoke with R-CALF USA CEO Bill Bullard. We talk about why have we lost 655,000 cattle producers out of the U.S. cattle industry over the past 4 decades. And why is that threatening our food security, which is actually a national security issue? We also talk about the misleading labeling of your meat. Do you really know where your meat is coming from? And why is it so important for us to know exactly where our meat originated from? I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Bill as much as I did. Hi, Bill. Thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Of course. So, I hadn't heard about your organization, and then I had Rancher AJ on, and he couldn't speak more highly of you. And so I said, I have to get this R-CALF USA on and to get more in depth about exactly what your organization does. So first, Bill, tell me a little bit about your background and why this organization was created.
Well, I'm a former cow-calf rancher from South Dakota and got caught up in the economic cost price squeeze of the 1980s and left the ranch, went back to college, and then spent some time in state government, and then was offered a position from an employment, well, for lack of a better word, a headhunter, looking for a CEO of a relatively new but fast-growing cattle association. And they asked if I was interested, and he got my attention. So I was a cow-calf producer, and now I represent thousands of cow-calf producers around the United States.
Okay, can you tell me exactly what that is, a cow-calf producer?
So in the cattle industry, which is the single largest segment of American agriculture, generating approximately $70 billion in cash revenues every year. And this industry is segmented. And so the farmers and ranchers that I represent are those who actually raise and sell cattle. So you have producers at the very foundation that raise or that maintain a mother cow herd, and they have a calf every year, and they raise the calf on the cow, and then typically would sell that animal after about 6 months. Those are cow-calf producers, those who maintain a herd year-round and generate a new calf every year from those cows. And if we look further downstream in the live cattle supply chain, after the calf is sold by the cow-calf producer, it will typically be purchased by a backgrounder or stocker, someone who will buy that 6-month-old calf and raise it for another 5 or 6 months, either on grass or on feed, but not trying to fatten the animal for harvest. Instead, they're trying to grow the animal. And then after the backgrounder or stocker keeps the animal for 5 to 6 months, they'll then sell that animal to the feedlot, and there the animal is finished. There it's fed a high concentrated ration to put fat and flavor on the meat, and then it's sent directly to the meat packer for slaughter or harvest to be converted into a consumable and very healthy protein product.
Okay. And so tell me exactly what you're doing to help the U.S. cattle and sheep producers.
Well, what we've seen in our industry over the past 4 decades, and that's just over a generation, is we've seen an alarming contraction in the number of participants in the cattle and sheep industries, in the number of meat packers in the cattle and sheep industries, in the number of marketing outlets available to those who remain in the industries. And in the cattle industry, we've seen an unprecedented decline in the number of the feedlots where the animal is finished prior to slaughter. And so our industry has been contracting at an alarming rate, and it's because we've allowed our industry to be controlled by multinational meat packers. And the multinational meat packers have gone to Congress for decades, and they have established a policy and legal and regulatory framework that benefits them. But they've done that at the expense of the producer. And so while the multinational meat packers are in control of the industry, our industry continues to decline. And our organization fights to reform those policies and regulations and legal requirements so that independent producers, the actual family farmers and ranchers in this country, can have an opportunity to be profitable. And so we work to reform trade policies, for example. We currently maintain a deficit in the trade of cattle and beef around the world. And as a result of this deficit, it leverages down domestic prices. It reduces demand for cattle produced by U.S. cattle producers, and it reduces their price. And so the price point falls below the level where they can recover even their cost of production, and they begin to drop like flies. And that's what's happened. We've lost over 5 of every 10 cattle producers in business just 4 decades ago are gone today. We've lost 52% of our producers. We've lost 655,000 cattle producers out of the U.S. cattle industry in just the past 4 decades. And we see the same thing in the sheep industry. We've lost 3 out of every 10 sheep producers that were in business. And there's a couple of industries that we are following, unfortunately, and that is what we view to be our sister industries, the hog and the dairy industry. In the hog industry, we've literally wiped out 91% of all hog producers in 4 decades. That means over 9 out of every 10 hog producers in business just over a generation ago, they're gone today. And instead, what we have is an industrialized production model controlled by huge corporations, multinational corporations, and they've essentially stripped from independent producers their freedoms and liberties and ability to maintain profitable operations. So the entire livestock industry has been in a severe state of contraction, and that should be of great concern to consumers, because as we shrink and begin to centralize and consolidate the production of beef and lamb in the United States, that industry becomes vulnerable to economic shocks. Shocks like geopolitical events, like the Ukraine war. Shocks like disease events, like what we've seen with the COVID pandemic in the early 2020s when it began. And like we're seeing now with the avian bird flu issue that has now jumped from birds to dairy cows. And so these kinds of events, when you're dealing with a,
Can
I'm
you
sorry.
explain a little bit, Bill, about, so let's take the last one that you talked about, the bird flu, right? So how exactly does that happen if you break it down in like simple kindergarten terms?
So bird flu has been around in the bird community for decades.
Right.
And it's been known to be transmitted via migratory birds. And it first began to affect the U.S. poultry operations. Now, U.S. poultry operations are highly concentrated, millions of birds in a single barn. Unlike a family farm and ranch operation, these corporations have just huge numbers of birds. And so when a flock like that is affected by the migratory bird flu that's transmitted to the domestic poultry, you have to euthanize literally millions of birds. That reduces the supply of chicken in the United States, increases the prices for consumers, and threatens our food security. Well, recently, and I cannot explain the scientific basis for how the avian influenza was transmitted to dairy cattle, but it has happened. And so what they found is that dairy cattle were shedding the virus in their milk, and the United States Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service is working diligently right now to contain that disease to prevent it from spreading even further. But the issue here is, if we had a disaggregated family farm system of agriculture like our industry or like our nation was built upon, then a disease outbreak like this would have minimal impact. And it's because production would be ongoing in other areas of the country. But when you concentrate the industry down in a certain segment of the United States, and the poultry industry, for example, is down in the Southeast, that high concentration of birds is just inherently more susceptible to a disease outbreak that could cause just tremendous economic harm. And that's what we're seeing. And so this is just another symptom, a negative symptom of the United States allowing the production sector to be taken control over by the multinational corporations.
Okay. So if I'm hearing it correctly, so there's a couple corporations that are coming in and they're kind of taking over with these large sort of factory farming type practices. And with that, when something like the bird flu comes along, then you're having to shut down so much production of these animals. So basically, and one of the issues that you have on your website is that we're just talking about when you're talking about the health of the animal. Okay.
Right. So we saw this striking example occurred in 2020 with the COVID pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
We had meatpacking facilities. They've been skeletonized. There's so few of them. Some of those could not operate at full capacity. And so we had poultry and hogs that are part of this factory farm type system of agriculture were backing up. And they literally had to euthanize millions of hogs and poultry because they simply couldn't market them. So that is the consequence of having a highly concentrated, centralized, and skeletonized production system that is
Right.
detrimental to the national security interests of U.S. consumers. But that's what we had. We saw the results. The results were millions of animals being euthanized. But importantly, it didn't happen in the cattle industry because the cattle industry is still what we view to be the last frontier. And the meat packers view it as the last frontier. It's the last livestock sector not to be vertically integrated. That means controlled from birth to plate by the multinationals. And so there's some semblance of competitive forces left in the U.S. cattle industry, and we fight to maintain them.
Okay. And so what are you guys doing to try to kind of take back control over the cattle and sheep industry?
Well, the first step in that process is to restore the opportunity for profitability for independent cattle producers. And the
Okay.
way to do that is to promote and support competition. And so we fight to ensure that we have competitive forces in the marketplace that are dictating winners and losers, not the multinational corporations that control the industry. We want competitive forces to be that determining factor. And so specifically what we have done is we've pursued reforms that will restore competition. Chief among those is the ability of consumers to choose to buy beef that is produced exclusively by U.S. cattle producers. And the only way they can do that is if the beef labeled in their grocery store is labeled as to the country of origin of the product. And so we have been fighting literally for 2 decades to have all beef sold in U.S. grocery stores to be labeled as to where the animal from which the beef was derived was born, raised, and slaughtered. That's called a country of origin label. We actually won that in 2002, only to have the implementation delayed for about 7 years because the multinational meat packers pushed back. Then we finally had it implemented beginning in 2009. And then in 2000 and around 12 and 13, the multinational meat packers partnered with 2 countries, Canada and Mexico, encouraging them to file a complaint at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. And they argued that our country of origin labeling law was somehow discriminating against their animals. And as a result, the World Trade Organization directed the United States to repeal the law, and Congress fell all over itself to do so in 2015. So since 2015, consumers could not initiate demand signals for U.S. beef or cattle from U.S. cattle producers. It's because when they go to the grocery store, they cannot tell whether the meat was produced by U.S. cattle farmers and ranchers or if it was produced by foreign cattle producers in Uruguay, Nicaragua, Honduras, Costa Rica, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, Australia, any one of the 20 countries that the meat packers are sourcing this undifferentiated beef and using it in order to increase their profits at the expense of producers on one end of the supply chain and consumers on the other.
So
So we seek reforms.
okay, so I have two questions on that.
Okay.
First is that I've heard, and tell me if this is correct, is that we can have beef, say, come from Brazil and they bring it over. And if they repackage it here in the United States, there can be some sort of labeling that could be a little bit misleading, thinking that it's from the United States. And my second part of that question is why, what is the benefit? So I'm thinking about, and I would like, well, if we're getting beef and other meats from other countries, wouldn't that be more expensive than for it to just come from the United States? Because it seems like a lot of, transporting. So can you touch on both of those?
Sure. So recall that I said that the meat packers for the past several decades have formed the policy, regulatory, and legal framework that benefits them. This is a perfect example.
Okay.
So what you described is absolutely true. The meat packers can import a beef steak from Brazil, bring it into the United States, and when it crosses U.S. Customs and Border Protection, it must be labeled as a product of Brazil. But the meat packers bring it into a U.S. processing plant. They take off the Brazilian package. They repackage that very same product, and they can affix legally a product of the USA label on that beef product and sell it to unsuspecting consumers who would believe that that was produced right here in America, and it was not. And so we fought against this. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has finally promulgated a rule that would require or that would reserve the product of USA label only for beef that was born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States. However, they're not going to enforce that new regulation until January 1 of 2026. So for 2 more years, consumers will be completely deceived by the erroneous label product of the USA because it could be on beef products that are exclusively produced in foreign countries. Now, the issue of the price of beef from these foreign countries.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a problem with currency devaluation in many countries where the country will lower the value of their currency. It will be much lower relative to the United States currency value, and it gives an inherent economic advantage and promotes more imports coming into the United States. But the other factor is that the foreign cattle producers do not have to meet the same stringent production and safety standards that we have to meet in the United States. And all of those are associated with additional costs. This imported product comes into the United States far cheaper than what the U.S. cattle producer can produce under the higher health and safety and production standards that we have to meet here. And so what's happening is the meat packers, knowing that consumers will seek out a product of USA food product because they know it was produced under the U.S. United States health and safety regime.
Mm-hmm.
They feel more confident in it. And so the meat packers know this, and that's why they're affixing this product of USA label on foreign beef, because they want to take advantage of the good name and reputation of the American family farmer and rancher. And they're doing it in a way that is exploiting the American family farmer and rancher and the consumer. They're deceiving the consumers. And the government has been complicit in this and has allowed this to continue and will continue to allow it to continue for 2 more years.
Oh my gosh. Wow. And so that would increase like a health risk to people as well, right? Because the safety standards are much lower.
Well, and we've seen that. You might recall back in 2017, the United States was not importing beef from Brazil for food safety reasons for many, many years. And then they decided that they would resume importation of Brazilian beef. And then Brazil was caught up in the criminal act of sending out tainted beef in the world market. And the United States was one of the last countries to close its borders to Brazilian beef, even knowing that Brazil was violating food safety standards. And so that's why country of origin labeling, and we call it mandatory country of origin labeling for beef, is so important to consumers, because they can watch the news, they can find out if there's a food safety problem in a particular country, and they can choose to avoid food products from that country until they are satisfied and confident that the food safety problem has been resolved. But without country of origin labeling, they're subservient to the government's decisions and the decisions of the multinational meat packers as to where to source the beef. And so country of origin labeling empowers consumers to make good choices based on informed decisions. And again, and very importantly, it's the only way competition works in a marketplace, in our economy. The competition has to start with the consumer. We want the consumer to have the choice. That can't happen without Congress's action to pass mandatory country of origin labeling for beef.
And then I would assume that when that passes or when that starts, then that's going to be very helpful for the local farmers because we want to get our beef and our meat products from the United States because of these stringent, health requirements that we have. And so that would be very beneficial to them.
That's right. We produce the best beef in the world, and we do it under the best of conditions. And our beef is produced under the highest health and safety standards the world over. And so consumers deserve to be able to choose that product at the grocery store. And again, this is why the meat packers are fighting so hard to prevent mandatory country of origin labeling, is because it's so profitable for them to source cheap from any one of these 20 foreign countries and pass it off to unsuspecting consumers as if it were produced right here. And that's the first most significant reform that needs to be made, and that will have a significant beneficial impact on the reversing the ongoing contraction of our industry.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about your No Rancher Left Behind campaign?
Well, associated with the decline in the number of cattle producers in this country, and when I say decline, that means these folks have been going out of business. They've invested their entire lives in many instances in maintaining the health of their cattle, maintaining the environment, the grass, the air, the water, and now they're forced out of business. And so with that comes a very intense and serious emotional strain on those producers. And so we had a member who came to us and said, he's from Missouri, came to us and said he had made the decision to end his life after losing his farm. And certain events occurred and intervened, and he didn't do it. And now he's become a very strong advocate for family farmers and ranchers. And we partnered with him to have a weekly meeting via telephone or via Zoom conferencing, where other similarly situated ranchers who are experiencing economic difficulties can discuss, what they're feeling, how their operations are going, what changes need to be made to correct this for their children and grandchildren. And so the No Rancher Left Behind is a recognition of how serious this issue is, not just from the economic standpoint, not just from a food safety standpoint and a national security standpoint, but from the well-being of humans. And so we're attempting to provide some assistance with that program.
Yes, I have heard of a lot of, farmers that can no longer produce, and this is generations. It's a family farm from generations. So it is very sad to see that happen to families. So tell me a little bit about your membership.
So we have approximately 4,000 members, and these are family farmers and ranchers scattered in 43 states in the United States. These are, independent producers that make their own decisions, purchasing decisions, marketing decisions, and they recognize that the environment around them it will eventually force them out of business if we do not make some major reforms to the structure of the industry. And so these are fighters. These are independent producers who are willing to stand up to the multinational meat packers and a government that has been catering to the multinational meat packers for decades in order to achieve the reforms needed so that they can maintain successful family farming and ranching operations and then pass it off to their children and grandchildren. And those are our members, the salt of the earth, the people who are out in the heat of the summer and the blizzards in the winter, caring for their animals and ensuring that U.S. consumers have an abundant and affordable and safe food supply in the United States.
When I was hearing you talk a few minutes ago, and you've mentioned it a couple times, and I was just wondering exactly what you mean by you say the risk of national security. What do you mean by that?
Well, we saw it for the first time in, I'm going to say history, but at least in memory.
Okay.
In early 2020, consumers went to the grocery store and could not buy the protein they needed for their family. And that's because the beef shelves were empty. and they are empty because our system has failed to achieve the high level of food security that we need. We do not want to be dependent on our food supply to foreign countries. We've seen how these geopolitical events can disrupt supply chains. We have to maintain either a very high level of self-sufficiency in food production or a complete self-sufficiency in food production. We have to achieve one of the two. And that is our national security interest, that in the event of a disease outbreak or some other economic shock, a climate-related disaster, a geopolitical event, whether those occur or not, U.S. consumers need to have an abundant, affordable, and wholesome supply of food. And that's the food security issue. You probably heard the saying, control the food, control the people. We want food to be controlled by disaggregated millions of farmers and ranchers scattered all across the United States. And we've got a long way to go to get back to that point.
That's right. Because when you're talking about it, if there's only a few corporations, that's a lot of control over a lot of people. So
that's right.
Let's talk a little bit about what can, say, myself and other listeners that are listening right now. They're like, okay, well, I'm not a local farmer, but I want to help your organization. How can I?
Well, so the decisions being made that affect whether or not independent cattle producers will survive are being made in Washington, D.C. by your elected members of Congress and both senators and your representatives. And so we're knocking on their doors every day, asking them, for example, to restore mandatory country of origin labeling for beef to help our independent livestock producers in the United States. We need consumers to be doing the same thing. We would like consumers to be calling their members of Congress and saying, I want to know where my beef is produced. I want to support the U.S. cattle farmer and rancher. And that would be extremely beneficial for consumers to do that. And they can support the organization. We're unique in that we don't receive any government subsidies or corporate subsidies to fund our organization. We rely exclusively on membership dues and contributions. And we do get contributions from consumers that believe that what we're doing is in their best interests. And so they're willing to support us that way. And for cattle producers, they can go to our website and join up as a member and be counted as among those who are dedicated and committed to reforming this industry so that we can once again achieve the level of food security we need as American citizens, but as well as to ensure that we have rural communities that are supported by strong economic industries like the cattle industry. You know, as we've lost 655,000 cattle producers over the past 4 decades, we've seen an associated hollowing out of rural communities all across America. They've lost their economic cornerstones that provided support for Main Street businesses. We have to reverse this process. It's going to take a long time, but we have to start somewhere. Mandatory country of origin labeling is the issue that consumers understand. They know what it is to be able to choose the food produced in the country of their choice at the grocery store, and only if Congress will pass the law can they achieve that objective.
And how do you see the future of R-CALF USA?
Well, we're going to keep fighting until we win. We have no choice. We have to restore the opportunity for independent farmers and ranchers to be successful in America. That's what built America, operating in a free enterprise system void of the control and interference by multinational corporations. You know, we talked about how concentrated the industry is. In our industry, we have 4 meat packers that control 85% of all the fed cattle, meaning all the cattle that are sold to the packer for beef. They control 85% of that market. So all that's left for independent meat packers is they're relegated to 15% of the market. And in somewhat of a promising situation, we're seeing some growth in that area. We're seeing more local beef packing plants. We're seeing more smaller regional beef packing plants. We fully support those. We're seeing more of our producers who are selling beef directly to the consumer. In fact, when the pandemic occurred and when consumers went to the grocery stores and couldn't buy beef, we immediately set up an internet platform. It's called usabeef.org. And we invited producers to add their names and addresses to that website that could sell beef directly to consumers. And then we told consumers, you can go to this website, usabeef.org, and you can find a producer in your area that you can buy beef directly from. And then you know how that animal was produced, where it was produced, and a reliable source of protein for them.
Oh, wow. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well, along with all of your information. So if you're listening, don't worry, it's in the show notes. And so before I let you go, Bill, is there anything that we haven't covered that you think someone should know?
Well, there's a lot of issues. And the one that's surfacing and will be prominent here in the very near future is the trade issue. There's a big fight in Washington as to whether or not we should impose tariffs on some of these imported products. And we use the example of the sheep industry that we view to be the canary in the coal mine for the cattle industry. In the sheep industry, we've seen an absolute explosion of imports from Australia and New Zealand. They arrive in the United States at a much cheaper price than we can produce here. And in 2022, 74% of all the lamb consumed in America was sourced from foreign countries. We have literally destroyed our commercial sheep industry in the United States. So now we have to look at solutions. And this is where reality confronts theory. Theory is you want free trade. Reality is free trade just killed our sheep industry. So what are we going to do? What we're promoting is we need to restore tariffs in order to provide our domestic industry the breathing room necessary to rebuild, because this is a national food safety issue, food security issue. And so the issue of tariffs is now becoming more prominent. We're seeing it in the steel industry. We've now had 2 presidential administrations who have supported these additional tariffs, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. That means this is now a bipartisan issue. Tariffs are a used and useful economic tool that we can deploy in order to preserve for America a strong disaggregated food production system. And so there'll be a lot of talk about that in the future, and we're going to be supporting it.
Wow. Gosh, there's so much information that you have that I've learned so much. So I want to thank you so much, Bill, for coming on here. I want everybody to go into our R-CALF USA. I'll have all the information in the show notes so you can take a look. If you're a local farmer, make sure to become a member. And obviously, if you're just listening, make sure to contribute. And what is it? usabeef.org too?
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
the other one? All
yes.
right.
And
Yeah,
for more, I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Well, I just say for more information about mandatory cool, they can go to labelOurBeef.com, labelOurBeef.com, and find much more information about country of origin labeling.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you're doing so much to help protect, the farmers within the US and then also the health and safety of the people that are consuming the meat. So you're doing so much for all of us, and I really appreciate everything that R-CALF USA is doing. So thank you, Bill, for coming on again. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in to another episode of the Truman Charities podcast. Until next time. Wow, I learned so much from this conversation with Bill. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, please make sure to rate and review the Truman Charities podcast. It means so much to us. And trust me, I read every single one of the reviews. And while you're at it, make sure to check the subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. If you would like to follow us, you can follow Truman Charities on Facebook at Truman Charities, Instagram, Jamie_Truman Charities. You can follow me, LinkedIn, Jamie Truman. And you can check out our website, trumancharities.com, to check out our upcoming events that we have going on. And also, don't forget, I wrote the book, Vanishing Fathers, The Ripple Effect on Tomorrow's Generation. 100% of the proceeds from that book go to charities that help at-risk youths. So you can grab the copy of that book on Amazon or any online bookstore. Thanks again for tuning in to the Truman Charities podcast. If you liked this episode, please make sure to rate and review our podcast. That is how more people learn about the Truman Charities podcast and our organization. And to make sure you don't miss any of our future episodes, subscribe. If you'd like to follow Truman Charities, you can follow us on Facebook at Truman Charities, Instagram at Jamie_Truman Charities, and check out our website, trumancharities.com.